On the evening of June 11th, 1930, a 39-year-old man named Joseph Mosinski of Queens, New York, would pick up his 19-year-old mistress named Catherine May and head to a destination the two had visited previously, which was a secluded place to park in an area called College Point. Now Joseph, he was married, and he had actually told his wife, who was watching the kids, that he had to run out and do some errands and would return shortly. The two would eventually park and had just jumped into the back seat. Just as they were getting into their makeout session, an unknown man would approach the car from the rear. He pulled out a gun and, with a German accent, ordered Joseph to get in the front seat and start the car. He would then slide into the back and sit next to Catherine. No sooner after Joseph started the car did the man fire the gun right into Joseph's right ear, followed by a second shot that went through his mouth. Joseph would fall over into the seat, but he did not die immediately. In fact, Catherine would state later on that she could hear Joseph groan in agony for the next few minutes. The man who fired the shots then ordered Catherine out of the car, and he began to rummage through Joseph's pockets. He then removed a few pieces of paper and set them on fire. Strangely enough, detectives would state later on that the suspect was most likely burning any document that had Catherine's name on it, in an attempt to keep the police from linking anything to her, as the man would tell Catherine he did not want her hassled by the police. By most accounts, this man, who was now for some bizarre reason trying to come off as a gentleman to Catherine, would actually sexually assault her. Afterwards, he would ask for her address, and he escorted her to the nearest bus stop, where the two boarded together. During the ride, he handed Catherine a note, but told her not to read it until the next day. After the bus stopped, he escorted her onto a trolley, and then the two went their separate ways. The next part, like a lot of the story, has two different accounts. One version said Catherine would actually comply and didn't read the note until the next day. Other versions of this story say she opened it after she got home. Regardless, she didn't call the police because of fear for her and her family. She also didn't want anyone knowing that she was involved with a married man, which was beyond scandalous in 1930. But it didn't matter, because the next day, authorities would contact her after they found her blood-soaked jacket in Joseph's car. The accounts don't say for sure, but I assume her jacket must have had some type of identification in it for the detectives to have located her so quickly. The police would bring her in for questioning, and she would hand them the note. When the police opened it, it simply read, quote, Joseph Mosinski, 3X, 3-X-097, end quote, which was obviously strange. This made no sense to the detectives, and they were actually confident now that Catherine was involved somehow in the planning of Joseph's murder. They would hold her on a $50,000 bail as a material witness, close to $900,000 in today's money, and would continue to interrogate her. After several hours of this, the 19-year-old would make a mistake that many falsely accused people make. She changed her story and said the whole murder was planned by an Italian mobster named Alberto Lombardo. But it didn't take police long to figure out that this person didn't exist, and they were now convinced even more that Catherine was implicated in Joseph's murder. Detectives went with the theory that she had tried to get Joseph to leave his wife, and he wouldn't, and then made up the sexual assault part of the story. Because really, what kind of man would do this and then escort the woman most of the way home before handing over a note with some kind of nonsense wrote on it? Catherine would end up admitting she made up the Italian mobster part in hopes that they would just let her leave, since they didn't believe her when she told them what really happened. After she admitted she lied, detectives would continue to grill her, but after this, she would never change her story again. She remained committed to the facts. The police would eventually clear her and let her go because they didn't have any real proof. After this, they would be tipped off to a man that was said to be an admirer of Catherine's. He was supposedly jealous that Catherine was seeing a married man, so in a fit of rage, he murdered Joseph. Police would actually find him on a California-bound train and took him in for questioning. He claimed he was going to attend his mother's funeral, not trying to flee the area. After interrogating him, he would be cleared fairly quickly, and the police were back to square one. But that didn't last for long because, just days after the shooting, a local newspaper would receive a letter stating that he was the killer of Joseph Mosinski, and quote, Gentlemen, for your information, the young lady, Miss C. May, involved in that case is innocent, and a victim of unfortunate circumstances. Mosinski was nothing but a rascal, a dirty rat. Not 2 women as stated in the paper, but 6, and 2 young girls, one 14 and one 15, were with him in that same place. I am an agent of a secret international order, and when I met Mosinski that night, it was to get from him certain documents, but unfortunately, they were not in his possession at that time." End quote. After this, he gave a description of the type of gun and ammo used, pretty much confirming he was the real killer. He would conclude his letter by saying that if the documents weren't returned to him, quote, 14 more of Mosinski's friends would join him, end quote. He would later identify this organization that he supposedly worked for as the Red Diamond of Russia, a secret society located across the world and composed of all nationalities. It should also be noted here that the man signed the note with a cryptic signature, that of an inverted V, with the notation V3X. The killer from here on out would be known as 3X. With this being the early 30s, there was no DNA testing, obviously. There was also no fingerprints found, and no leads. But 5 days later, 26-year-old Noelle Solie and Elizabeth Ring were sitting in a parked car near Creedmoor, Queens. The two, like Joseph and Catherine, were looking for a place with privacy and found a desolate junkyard. Elizabeth would later tell detectives that a man with a German accent approached Solie's car and demanded his driver's license. The man would then look up into the distance on the opposite side of the car and flickered his flashlight off and on. When Noelle asked what he was doing, 3X said that he was signaling to his friends on the hill that he didn't need assistance. He then asked Noelle if he knew Joseph Mosinski, to which Noelle replied no. The man would then shoot Noelle anyways. Despite the wound, Noelle would exclaim, "I'm not the man you're looking for." 3X would then walk to the rear of the car and flash the light on his license plate and walk back to the front door again. He would look back at Solie and say, quote, "You're the guy we want, all right. You're going to get what Joe got," end quote. He would then shoot Solie in the head. He again rummaged through the deceased man's pocket before pulling out a piece of paper and proclaiming, quote, "I got it," end quote. He then jumped into the car and tried to kiss Elizabeth. Before seeing that she wore a medallion of St. Joseph, he stopped suddenly and asked her if she was Catholic, and she replied that she was. He would then say, quote, "Well, it's lucky for you that you are. I wouldn't hurt you for anything. God is the only one I fear," end quote. And just like with Catherine, he would escort Elizabeth to a bus stop and then rode with her a bit of the way before giving her a handwritten note and disappearing. The note said only, quote, "Solie," end quote, and stamped with red ink were the characters 3X. Elizabeth did not go to the police until the next day, again out of fear. Detectives would also find another key clue here that linked the murders together, and again, there are 2 different accounts, but basically, a clipping of a newspaper article detailing Mosinski's murder was found on the scene. Next to that article, someone had penciled in, quote, "Here's how," end quote. Depending on which version of the story you believe, the newspaper clipping was either found in Solie's lap or in his coat pocket. Regardless, it was a note from 3X that directly tied the 2 murders. Shortly after this, ballistic tests, which were still pretty new at this point in time, would also confirm that the bullets used in both murders were fired from the same gun. Meanwhile, a local newspaper would also receive another letter from someone who identified himself as the 3X killer. The note said, quote, "For your information, one more of J. Mosinski's friends was sent to meet him. V-5 Solie was shot to death near Floral Park and not very far from the police station. I enclosed the 2 empty shells. Some of our money was found on his person and the N.Y. document. The girl was, as in the case of Miss May, put aboard a bus and sent home, but no clues were left for you this time. 13 more men and 1 woman will go if they do not make peace with us and stop bleeding us dry," end quote. The story would now explode, and it become one of the most extensive NYPD searches in history. Over the next 19 days, 2,000 uniformed officers and 425 specialized police units combed the area. Patrolmen were also sent to guard secluded roads and parking spots that lovers were known to use. The $10,000 a day police search, which is about $900,000 in today's money, would continue with no luck though. Suspect after suspect was brought in for the two women to identify. Over 50 were ruled out, and things still didn't calm down. 3 days after this, Joseph Mozinski's brother in Philadelphia would receive a letter in which the writer threatened to kill him if he did not return, quote, those papers, quote. Joseph's brother would tell police he had no idea what this was about, and he had no idea what documents this insane person was referring to. Authorities by this point knew they had a psychopath in their midst. Panic was setting in. Couples stopped going to lovers' lanes. People stopped going out late. Papers and media of the day ran wild with the story, particularly in the Northeast. Remember, this was only 1 year after the stock market crash. Most people were broke and had nothing to do, so they become hooked into this story. This man had just killed 2 men at random and was taunting the police about some mysterious documents and this international organization he worked for. But the police had precious little in the way of clues. Even the two descriptions from Elizabeth and Catherine were miles apart. Catherine described him as a 40-year-old man with wrinkles, 5'6", 125 pounds, pale complexion, wore dark clothes, and a dark gray soft hat, and as mentioned previously, spoke with a German accent. She also remarked that he was short and to the point, whereas Elizabeth said he was closer to 30 years old, not 40, and that he was 6 foot tall and 165 pounds, which was a half a foot taller and 40 pounds heavier than Catherine's description. She would also say that he had sunken cheeks, a lanky build, little hump on the bridge of his nose, small eyes, thick lips, peculiar teeth, black suit, black bow tie, white shirt, soft white collar, and a black fedora. And she also thought he had a German accent. Also noted was that he wore a small round bronze button on the left lapel of his coat that said, quote, Rifle Association, end quote. So basically, the only thing the two agreed on was that he was thin, pale, wore a hat, and had a German accent. Not very much to go on. Luckily, the police would receive a letter shortly after that said, quote, Mission has ended. No further cause of worry, end quote. According to the letter, 3X would claim he was a former officer in the German army and had become a special agent of this alleged group, called Red Diamond of Russia. He stated that Mozinski and Soli were former agents as well, but they had, quote, came in contact with a gang of blackmailers and a drug ring and turned against us, end quote. One of them allegedly stole 3 important documents from the organization, and now the 3 documents had been recovered. 3X would state, quote, This is final. You know what we want you to know. Quiet your people and tell them 3X is no more, end quote. Although police were hopeful, they couldn't be for sure that he was really done killing. They would continue to search for the perp. The letters would stop coming in from 3X though, and again, the accounts vary, as most versions of this story claim that 3X was never heard from again. But I found this newspaper clipping from about a year and a half after the murders that said on October 17th of 1931, police received another letter from 3X that said, quote, I'm back, and I will pay every cop a visit, end quote. Over the next decade, several people would receive letters allegedly from 3X, but detectives were able to confirm that they were all copycats, and it's generally seen that the last official communication was the one police received in 1931. Detectives, however, did continue to search for years, and for their part, they were never able to verify that the Red Diamond of Russia organization actually existed, although they pretty much were in agreement that it was just a made-up story. If it did exist, no one has ever confirmed it, but it is possible that this group was removed during one of the Stalin purges. In fact, in one of the letters from 3X, he would claim that this Russian group did not approve of the Soviet Union and was fighting against it. So this group did conceivably exist and could have just been erased from Russian history. Detectives eventually dropped this line of thinking though, and started looking at the real possibility that it may have been an escapee from the Kings Park State Asylum for the Insane. The man's name was Mad Joseph Ustica, and he had been sent to that asylum originally after he had killed a man that was described as being, quote, accompanied by a woman, end quote. And again, just like 3X, he did not kill the woman. This man Joseph Ustica also rambled continuously about secret papers and codes. I found it in this news article from 1930. However, I could never find out what happened with this escapee or this theory, only that 3X was never captured. Close to 100 years later, and the killer has still never been identified. Although the detectives then, as well as the armchair sleuths now, tend to believe one of two theories. Firstly, the man was obsessed and hated Joseph Mosinski. For what reason? Who knows. He knew about his multiple affairs, as well as where he was parking with these girls. He also knew the address of where Joseph's brother lived in Philadelphia. He even called him a rascal in the letter to the papers, which is probably a big insult back then. Yet, 3X barely spoke about Noel at all. This has led many to believe that Joseph was the real target, and that 3X only murdered Noel to try and trick the police into believing a crazy killer with ties to an organization that may or may not exist was on the loose, thereby keeping police from looking at anyone close to Joseph who may have held a grudge. The other theory goes back to money and gambling. Joseph liked to gamble on baseball, and he was actually found with a baseball pool ticket in his pocket. It said 3X067, which was very close to the note that the killer gave Catherine that said 3X907. In fact, the day Joseph was murdered, he placed a $2,500 bet and won $3,700 on it, which is akin to betting $45,000 and winning $65,000 in today's money. Also, Joseph had just made an $8,000 deposit, $140,000 in today's money, that his family had no explanation for and had no idea where it came from. And in Noel's case, a wad of cash was found in the car. The amount was never released, but it must have been quite a bit. These were insane amounts of money for the Great Depression. Could these men have screwed over the wrong person in a bet, or were they dabbling in crime themselves? Investigators at one point had looked at Mosinski's death as a result of an alcohol bootlegging war, but they could never prove it. If true, how was Noel linked? There's one last thing I wanted to touch on, and that is the connection with the Zodiac. It's been a theory in the past couple of decades that the Zodiac possibly took inspiration from 3X. There are a few striking similarities. They both used cryptic messages and ciphers in their letters to the police. There was also the near or complete lack of communication with his victims. His letters were very direct and concise in their wording. He also made up his own nickname. And all of the murders took place at a lover's lane, except for one of Zodiac's. But the Zodiac's first murder was in 1968, and he was said to be between 26 and 30 at the time, so he wouldn't have been old enough to have lived during 3X's reign. However, several detective and crime magazines that circulated in the 50s retold the story of 3X, sometimes exaggerating his crimes. If the Zodiac was like a lot of serial killers, it's quite possible that he researched previous killers and could have come across these magazines in his teenage years. He could have taken the basic ideas from 3X and expanded on them, doing it at a time in the 60s when the media coverage was much more widespread. But like a lot of other things with this case, we'll never know for sure. Hey guys, thanks for listening. I wanted to do this one outside the iceberg because it's so long and crazy, and I thought it was interesting enough to stand on its own. The fact that he sent letters to the press explaining everything he did and why he did it was pretty rare. He also announced when he was done killing, which was very odd. I also wanted to share because it's fairly obscure, and that might be because it came right after the stock market crash in 1929, which overshadowed it, as well as the fact that 3X only had 2 victims, and most authorities define serial killers as having 3 or more victims, so you don't see 3X on a lot of serial killer documentaries or on internet lists. Heck, 3X doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. Anyways, I hope you guys found this as interesting as I did. Until next time, sleep well, friends.